Okay, today we are going to begin reading the book of Ezekiel. Alright, so before we begin, of course, I'm going to give some intro to Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a contemporary of Jeremiah and Daniel. He is basically the equivalent of Jeremiah on the Babylonian side of the equation. So Jeremiah, which we just got done reading, was a prophet, a priest. He was a member of a priestly family, although it's not clear whether he ever actually served as a priest, but I don't think he did. I don't really know for sure. Jeremiah was a prophet in Jerusalem and was there all throughout the city's decline and fall. He was there when the city fell. He saw it all happen. He was left in the land after the city fell. He dealt with the survivors. And that's the book of Jeremiah, which we got done reading. Ezekiel has a similar experience, but he's in Babylon. He's in Babylonia. He's in Babylon already. Ezekiel is taken in one of the waves of captives. Unlike Jeremiah, who was never taken to Babylon, Ezekiel was taken to Babylon and spent presumably the rest of his life there and ministered to the people, the exiles who were in Babylon. So he's giving basically the same message that Jeremiah is giving. While Jeremiah is in Jerusalem and talking to the people there who are about to, they've already had Nebuchadnezzar come against them a couple of times. And Ezekiel was taken in one of those waves of deportation, but they're going to be destroyed. Even after, Ezekiel was taken in the year 597 BC, which is the year that Jehoiachin, the second to last king of Israel, or Judah I should say, was taken captive. He was only 18 years old. He was taken captive by Babylon, and his uncle Mattaniah was set up on the throne as king by Nebuchadnezzar, to be a stooge, basically, for Nebuchadnezzar, and he changed his name to Zedekiah, and that was the last king of Israel, or Judah, excuse me. Ezekiel was taken at that time, and he dates his ministry and his work as a prophet in the land of Babylon to that year of Jehoiachin's capture. And Jehoiachin, Jeconiah, as we talked about a couple times when we read Jeremiah, seems to have been kind of viewed as the rightful king. Zedekiah was a steward placed on the throne by Nebuchadnezzar, meant to be a vassal and a steward for him. He was an uncle to Jeconiah. Jeconiah was actually the proper son of Jehoiakim, the previous king, whereas Zedekiah was a brother of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah. So they went backwards in the line of succession when Zedekiah became king. And it's not clear whether or not Zedekiah was ever truly accepted as king. In fact, I don't think he was. I think he was always kind of viewed as a usurper or a stooge or just not a legitimate king. Which I said when we read the book of Jeremiah seems to have contributed, probably was a major contribution to his insecurity and his wishy-washiness and his indecisiveness. Anyway, Ezekiel is not going to be dealing with him, because Ezekiel is not in Jerusalem. He is not in the land of Judah. He is in Babylon, and is distant and disconnected from what's going on in Jerusalem because he's not there. He's 1,000 miles away in Babylon. So he's talking to the people who are with him in Babylon, the Jewish exiles who are with him in Babylon, and they've not been there very long. Okay, when the book begins, they have been there for 5 years. Okay, and they're still hoping, expect soon. When Ezekiel starts, they seem to be living, he and the others seem to be living in some kind of a refugee camp or something along a river near Babylon. And it seems as though they're still holding out hope that they won't be there a whole heck of a lot longer. They are going to be there, okay? Jeremiah had to give them the same message. In Jeremiah 29, he sends a letter to these people and tells them to just, settle down, move into houses. Don't keep living in these refugee camps or these tents. Move into houses, settle down, plant fields, get married, have children. You're going to be there a while, okay? You're going to be there for a couple of generations. There's no need to keep living in a tent by the river hoping that you'll be able to go back again sometime soon. Like, it's not going to happen. You're going to be here for a while. You're going to be here for 70 years to be exact. When Ezekiel is taken captive, they're down to about 60 years left. The 70-year period seems to have started with the first wave of deportations, which was around 605 BC. Ezekiel's people were taken in the second wave, which is 597 BC. So they're going to be a while. So it's only been a few years, and they got 70 years to go. They've only been there for a few years. They're going to be here a while. They're not going to be... But it doesn't seem as though they've really accepted that yet. When Ezekiel starts ministering in the 5th year of their exile, they've been there for 5 years, and it seems like they're still kind of holding to the hope that they'll be able to go back again fairly soon. And it's not going to be the case. They've still got 50-plus years of captivity left ahead of them. Ezekiel is a very strange book, and is probably one of the most overlooked books in the Old Testament, certainly among the prophets. There's a lot in Ezekiel that is... Ezekiel is not directly quoted very much in the New Testament, but there's a lot in Ezekiel that is kind of evoked or reflected in the content of the New Testament. There's going to be a lot of overlap between Ezekiel and Revelation, for example. And Ezekiel is going to mention this term Son of Man a lot, which Jesus uses for himself in the Gospels. And we'll get to that, explain that as we go. But it is a very strange book. It's actually, however, probably, of these big prophet books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, it's actually probably the easiest. Assuming that we are thoroughly grounded in what's going on in Ezekiel, and we understand the context, which we get from Jeremiah and the historical books. Once we know, and we've already done that, okay, so we've already read that. We've read the historical books, we've read Jeremiah, we've read Isaiah, we've spent a great deal of time immersing ourselves in the history of this part of history of this section of the Bible. So we should be pretty good with that. We should be, once we've got a firm handle on the contextual information that is provided in the other books around Ezekiel, we're going to be pretty well equipped to handle Ezekiel itself. Ezekiel, once you've got that historical information implanted into you, Ezekiel will largely explain itself, because we'll have already entered into the environment that Ezekiel is speaking to, and we'll know what he's talking about because we have studied it in other books. That doesn't mean it doesn't have its challenges, though. The primary challenge of understanding Ezekiel is that he is speaking... Now, he doesn't have any poetry, okay? Jeremiah had a lot of poetry. Isaiah had almost nothing but poetry. Most of the other prophets spoke in poetry. Ezekiel uses very little poetry. He was not a poet. There's only a couple of songs or poems in the entire book. It's 48 chapters long, and there's only a small number of short songs scattered in the entire book. It's almost all prose. So in that regards, it's going to be much more straightforward, because it's basically a narrative of what he saw, the experiences he had as he got his messages from God and then gave them to the people. And that's going to be pretty straightforward in that regards. We're not going to have to interpret a lot of funny figurative language or poetic expressions that aren't meant to be taken literally. And a lot of times, when he does speak in parables or riddles, he'll explain them. Okay, he does speak in parables, like Jesus does in the New Testament. He doesn't speak in poems, but he does speak in parables. However, most of the times when he does that, he'll go right on to explain the parable immediately. The problem with Ezekiel is that it's very visionary, very visual, okay? Ezekiel's challenge... Okay, remember, Ezekiel is living in the early 500s BC. His ministry he was taken captive into Babylon in 597 BC. His ministry starts 5 years later in 593 or 592 BC. He ministers as a prophet for over 20 years. His last vision is dated to 571 BC, according to our calendars. And who knows what happens to him after that. So he lives in the early 500s BC. He was probably 30 years old when he was appointed as a prophet. So he was born around 627 BC and lived 50 or 60 years, who knows how long. So he is speaking to people of that time period. His materials are written down, and now we're reading them today. So there's always going to be that challenge. But like I said, by understanding the contextual information contained in the other books around Ezekiel, we can really help ourselves understand Ezekiel. So we're not going to really have that problem. We've read Jeremiah, we've read the historical books. We're armed, and we're well armed with information about the context of this period. However, Ezekiel's challenge is that he is trying to communicate to people with words, okay, things that he has seen. Right at the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, he has a vision. And this vision is very awesome and awe-inspiring, and it leaves him kind of shaking and speechless for several days. And his task then, as a prophet, is to speak to people the vision that he has seen. And only he has seen it, okay? Only he saw the vision of Ezekiel 1. So no one else ever saw it. Other prophets had similar visions of similar creatures, I think, elsewhere in the Bible. We'll talk about those when we read Ezekiel 1. But Bahiel is unique in having seen this vision amongst the exiles along the Kiber River, or whatever it's called. And he is trying to communicate this vision to the people with spoken words. And then his prophetic ministry in Babylon is going to be spent with him acting out his prophecies like an actor almost, like a street dramatist. He is going to be building little play sets that represent Jerusalem and things like that. And he's going to actually be like acting with them. He's going to be visually mimicking what his visions are, his words, the word he gets from God, so the people around him can see what he's doing. And it's like, what is Ezekiel up to? Now, we've seen other prophets do some stuff like this. Jeremiah took this clay pot and went to the valley of Ben Hinnom with this clay pot and gave a lesson to the people. He brought the leaders down with him, and then he shattered the pot and said, God's going to shatter you like I just shattered this pot. Isaiah, his entire family was assigned to the people, himself and his sons and the names that they had. The woman he apparently married in Isaiah 7 and 8 was a sign, which ended up being used as a test for the virgin sign of Jesus' birth in the Gospels. And Isaiah went naked for 3 years as a sign to the people of what's going to happen to them in the siege and the captivity. So the prophet in Hosea married Gomer and was told to marry Gomer, and his entire married relationship and the kids he had with her were a sign to the people, a visual sign to the people. So the idea of the prophets themselves as acting as visual signs to the people is not new. Ezekiel is not doing anything here that other prophets haven't done per se, but he is taking it to another level. A lot of his book is going to be about his account of him acting out these words that God gave him in front of the people. Now, again, remember, Ezekiel is speaking to the people of his day. He's communicating to them with spoken words, these visions that he's getting from God. And he's writing them down, and that's what we have to go on. We don't even have the benefit, only Ezekiel ever saw these visions of the cherubim and whatever else God showed him. But we don't even have, nobody else saw that. So the people that he was performing in front of didn't see that either. Only Ezekiel ever saw that. But we don't even have the benefit of seeing Ezekiel act out these prophecies like the people around him did. When he's lying on his side for 430 days or whatever, like we don't see him do that. So it's a little hard to understand exactly what's being done or what message is being communicated by doing that. Because we don't see it. All we get is the written word left over about what he did and the message that he spoke. Now, as a writer myself, I can tell you the most challenging part of writing, and I write fiction, and the most challenging part of writing is to take the image I have in my head and communicate that with words. Like, that is work. Now, that actually requires work. That is not easy to do. I have no artistic ability whatsoever. If I could draw, if I could communicate these images, if I could express these images I get in my mind when I lie down and think about the stories I'm working on, if I could express that in imagery as an artist would, I probably would have done that for a living. But I can't. I have no ability to do that whatsoever. I can't even draw a dot. I'm that limited in my artistic ability. So I, therefore, have to take that image I see in my head. When I close my eyes and I think about it, and my imagination forms this image in my mind's eye, I have to find some way to convert that into words. And that is difficult. That is a challenge. That is not easy. That is work. Like, that is legitimately, maybe not everybody does that, maybe not everybody sees that as work, but that is effort. That does not come naturally. It does not come easily. And whenever I do it, no matter how satisfied I might end up being with the resulting written product, I'm always going to wish I could communicate it better, because it's never quite going to match up to what I see in my head. And I'm a fiction writer. I can only imagine the challenge and the struggle was that way, and even more so for Ezekiel. He saw the vision of these cherubim and the throne of God, the chariot of God coming to him. How can he communicate that? How can he express that? How can the written word express that? Or the spoken word, because he would have spoken it out loud to his fellows initially. Well, really, in the end, it can't. Okay? And so, like, we're always going to be kind of struggling to understand what Ezekiel is trying to tell us, because words fundamentally cannot capture the vision that Ezekiel had. And even when he is performing his demonstrations in front of the people, like, we're still not seeing him do that. They had the advantage. They didn't see his visions either. Only he ever saw those. But they got to see him perform in front of them. And we don't even have that advantage. And there are going to be some times when it is kind of hard to grasp exactly what he's talking about. So that's the main problem with the book of Ezekiel. It's a very visionary book. It doesn't have a lot of poetry, very little in fact, only a couple of songs in the entire book. So we're not going to have to deal with figurative language or hyperbolic expressions in the form of poetry, like we have with every other prophet book so far. But we are going to have it's a lot of prose, and we are going to have a lot of descriptions of visions and things that Ezekiel saw, or visual acts that he performed in front of the people. And they're going to be a little hard to follow, because we're not seeing what Ezekiel is seeing. And we're not seeing what Ezekiel is showing the people. We're reading about it, and it is going to be a little hard to follow in that regard. And Ezekiel is writing to people of his generation, not us. So he's writing in 6th century BC Hebrew to 6th century BC Hebrew-speaking people living in Babylon. He's not writing to 21st century AD English speakers in the United States of America or other English-speaking nations. And so it's like it is, again, I said before, we're going to have to enter his world to understand his message, because he's not going to enter ours. Okay? And we're going to see, now again, because we have already studied Jeremiah and historical books, we know the context of Ezekiel's message. But culturally, there are still going to be gaps between him and us, because he lived 2,600 years ago on the other side of the world, in a very different time, place, and culture and language than we are in today. So there are going to be times when he says something that and we're going to have a very different reaction than what he expects us to have, or what he wants us to have. And we're just going to have to accept that. That's because he's a 6th century BC man living in 6th century BC times, and we're going to have to accept that that's what he is, and he's never going to be anything but that. And we're going to have to let him be what he is, because he's not going to become what we are. In particular, his commentary about picturing Judah as a woman, as a bride of God, is going to leave us somewhat uncomfortable. But the reaction he's intending to provoke in the people who are hearing his message is very different from the reaction that he's actually going to get from us today. So we're just going to accept that and keep that in mind. Ezekiel was a priest. I should say he was from a priestly family. He never actually served as a priest in the Jerusalem temple, because he was taken captive before he could. These priests were entered into service at age 30, and he gets called to be a prophet apparently in his 30th year, which would have been the year he would have entered as a priest. And he'd already been in captivity for 5 years. So he was taken captive when he was 25. Which means he never actually served and priests were retired from service at age 50. And we know he continued ministering at least beyond age 50, because the last prophecy he gives in this book is dated to 22 years after his first prophecy, which means he would have been 52. And he was in Babylon the whole time. And by the time he's finished as a prophet, the temple has been destroyed. So he never served as a priest. He never actually had the opportunity to serve as a priest. He clearly trained for it. Now, Jeremiah was also from a priestly family. But it's not clear to me whether Jeremiah ever served as a priest, even though he was in Jerusalem and was at the temple a lot. It's not clear to me whether he ever served as a priest, or whether he even trained to serve as a priest. I'm just not clear on that. Jeremiah received his call very early in life, as a teenager, apparently, or a very young man. And he was not liked by his peers. So it's possible that he was barred from being trained to serve as a priest or entering the priesthood, even though he was in the temple, he was in Jerusalem and went to the temple, and there's several scenes in Jeremiah take place there. It's not clear to me whether he ever actually serves as a priest, and he doesn't really talk like a priest, at least not like Ezekiel does. Ezekiel talks like a priest. Okay, we're going to have a lot of callbacks to the law in this book. We're going to have a lot of callbacks to Exodus. We're going to have a lot of callbacks to Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the law code, the Levitical code, the holiness code. Okay, we're going to have a lot of that. Jeremiah didn't really do that, even though he was a priest. He was from a priestly family. Ezekiel never served as a priest. He never had the opportunity to serve as a priest, but clearly he wanted to. Clearly he had studied and trained to be a priest. Never got the opportunity to serve as a priest, but his book is just infused entirely with priestly images and priestly expressions and priestly instructions, and just, I mean, he is a priest. This man wanted to be a priest. He became a prophet instead, but he wanted to be a priest, and it's very evident, reflected in his writings. Something else about Ezekiel, one of the things that makes this book easy to grasp for our standards today, is that it's actually written, for the most part, in chronological order. Ezekiel dates every time he gets a vision from God, he dates it, very specifically, down to the day of the month, even. And for the most part, his prophecies are actually arranged in chronological order. At least all the stuff involving his fellow people are. We start from when he gets his call from God while he's sitting at near the river in the 5th year of their exile. And we go all the way to the 27th year of their exile when he gets his last vision from God. There is a section in the middle of the book where he talks about the other nations, not Judah, not Jerusalem, not the people around him, but the Ammonites, the Moabites, the usual suspects. And those are not written in chronological order. Those are arranged differently. But other than that, the sections of the book that are about the people of God, about Judah, Jerusalem, the temple, and his fellow exiles there in Babylon, those are actually arranged in chronological order, if you can believe it. If you can believe it, it is actually a chronologically organized book, which is stunning because the prophets never cared about that. Ezekiel probably only cared about it in the sense that his visions were, he was basically getting updates from God on the conditions in Jerusalem as the city fell. So he dates his prophecies according to that. This book kind of has the feel of a diary, almost. Ezekiel speaks in the first person all throughout the book. He only refers to himself in the third person once or twice, basically just to introduce himself and give us his name. Other than that, he speaks like in the first person, like this is his actual life. Like this is his account. It's almost like his memoirs. Again, it's kind of like a diary. It's like he's almost like writing down a diary and leaving it behind for people after his death. Unlike Jeremiah, where you can tell Jeremiah wrote his prophecies down, and even in the book itself, there are several instances where we read about Jeremiah writing down some version of his message, and then afterwards, clearly, either he or Baruch or both of them together or something like that, compiled them all and left them in the book, the form that we have. Or Isaiah, who clearly did the same thing in his later days, after his ministry was largely over as a speaking prophet. Ezekiel's book gives the account that he's kind of writing it as it happens. It feels a lot like an ancient version of cable news, because he's getting these updates from God about what's going on. He's in Babylon, okay, east of the Euphrates River, and he's getting these visions from God about what's happening out west in Jerusalem, 1,000 miles away or whatever it is. And he's getting these updates as they're happening. So it kind of gives the impression of being like an ancient version of cable news. Like, here's what's the breaking news that's going on in Jerusalem right now. And he's transported to Jerusalem in visions to see what's going on there. And it appears as though he just kind of like wrote down his experiences pretty much as soon as he had them. Or at the very least, it gives off that impression. Because of that, it actually makes it easier for us to understand today, because it's organized more like how we organize our information today than how most of these Hebrew prophets organize their information. Also, to keep in mind that Ezekiel was in Babylon. Even at the time the book begins, he'd been in Babylon for 5 years. So, and even though he was living with his people in apparently some sort of refugee camp along the river, some form of cultural osmosis seems to have already imprinted itself on him, even at the time the book begins, because he's already kind of taking to Babylonian customs and culture in a way that the Judean prophets who never left Judah don't seem to have done. So anyway, that's the book of that's a preview, the intro to the book of Ezekiel, and now it's time to actually begin reading the book of Ezekiel.